which is debate on motion 23450 in the name of Liam Kerr on the independent review of complaints handling, investigations and misconduct issues in relation to policing. Can I ask those who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons, and I call on Liam Kerr to speak to and move the motion for up to 7 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I move the motion in my name up front. Let me begin by thanking Dame Eilish Angelini for her independent review into police complaints handling, investigations and misconduct. It is a sobering and at times shocking read. It tells us this: the SNP's system of police complaints and governance has been broken since inception. Dame Eilish's forensic analysis has been described as a watershed moment for policing in Scotland, and fixing the SNP's apparatus is vital in order to repair and enhance public confidence. Which is why, given that the SNP got the report, issued a bland press release, then disappeared, the Scottish Governments have called today's debate in opposition time. But this is also about supporting and protecting the thousands of police officers to whom we all owe an immense debt of gratitude. These men and women selflessly keep us safe every single day, and nothing which will be said by these benches, and I am sure across the chamber today, questions their commitment, their ability, or their professionalism. They deserve to know that the complaints process is efficient, transparent, proportionate and fair. Now, yesterday, Douglas Ross and I met with a group of women from different parts of our policing community. They included a former constable, a firearms officer, a senior officer and a former SPA board member. They had all experienced injustice. But thanks to the structures implemented in a rush by the SNP, it was the starting point for something worse. Because when they engaged with the complaints process, they were let down. Not only were careers ruined, some suffered ill health and life-changing financial loss. Karen Harper spent 22 years as a constable in Lanarkshire and Dumfriesshire before being forced to retire through ill health and later won her sex discrimination claim. Ms. Harper describes the report as an exoneration for myself and many other officers betrayed by the fundamentally unfair system. What angers Ms. Harper most is how the corrosive saga that has consumed her life for 5 long years could have been prevented at the outset if only the system had been fair. She tried everything. In 2015, she even contacted the First Minister. She began by saying that writing was a last resort. However, all she got back was a brief and impersonal letter from a junior civil servant, which didn't address any of the serious and specific issues she had raised. Now, the Cabinet Secretary will no doubt remind me it is not the place for politicians to meddle in process or influence public bodies in discharge of duty. But what happens when the systems put in place to protect the public and police officers fail? Now, since the creation of Police Scotland 7 years ago, there has been a relentless flow of troubling revelations around the complaints process and governance. I spoke with Moy Ali, a former member of the Scottish Police Authority. Ms. Ali resigned over concerns about a lack of transparency, contrary to public interest and good governance, and spoke out. But nothing substantive changed. I also spoke with Angela Wilson, a former Assistant Chief Constable in Tayside. She bemoaned the deafening silence from the Scottish Government on this report, and she is surely right to do so. Ms. Wilson believes that major change is necessary for Scotland to achieve a diverse police service that truly reflects those it represents. So how do we do that? Well, Dame Eilish makes more than 100 recommendations over her preliminary and final reports. We don't have time today to give a proper consideration to the relative merits of each, but we can, in this debate, focus on some of the most fundamental ones, such as the need for the PERC to be truly independent and to be given the power it needs to become an effective watchdog. Furthermore, she rightly states the PERC should no longer be answerable to ministers, but to this Parliament. And then there's the SPA. Dame Eilish recommends the authority should be stripped of its power to investigate senior officers, citing possible perception of bias due to their close working relationship. Another recommendation is the need for serious misconduct proceedings to continue against officers, even if they resign or retire. On which point, Dame Eilish urges the Scottish Government to work with the UK Government to adopt good practice from England and Wales by extending barred and advisory lists to Police Scotland. These are public databases of officers dismissed for gross misconduct or who left whilst being investigated. There are numerous other areas where Dame Eilish urges this government to learn something about transparency from our friends in the rest of the UK. These include the holding of police gross misconduct hearings in public, as happens in other professions, and allowing for accelerated misconduct hearings in cases with apparently incontrovertible evidence of guilt. Some of these require amending existing legislation or possibly new laws. Others need structural, procedural, or even cultural changes within Police Scotland, the SPA, or the PARC. All of them need ministers to act. However, what has been notable, worrying even, has been the response so far from the SNP. Dame Eilish's 150,000-word, 500-page publication was made public 2 weeks ago today. It was on ministerial desk prior to that. Yet what has been the SNP's response? A bland press release which contained little more than vague platitudes and completely lacked any firm commitment to act. Hiding behind the defence that they commissioned this report in the first place is rendered meaningless by inaction. We need to see action. Do I have time, Presiding Officer?
Briefly. Hamza Yousaf.
Just to say that I have spoken, of course, to Police Scotland, the SPA, the Crown, some of the key stakeholders around recommendations in this report. I just wonder if Liam Kerr has spoken to any of those key partners, of course, to which the recommendations are aimed towards.
Liam Kerr.
Yes, of course. And I would like to, in order to assist the Cabinet Secretary, provide a suggestion which comes from Ashi Moe Ali, but will be endorsed by many of the stakeholders. I'm sure he's interested to hear this, because like many of the best ideas, it is very simple, and there is no excuse for not implementing it. Cabinet Secretary, list all of Dame Eilish's recommendations online on the Scottish Government website for the public to see. Alongside each, list whether the Scottish Government accepts the recommendation or not. And if not, why not? And if so, then let's have further columns showing which agency is responsible for progressing it and tracking where they're up to. This action tracker can inform the public. To adopt it would be inexpensive and a signal of sincerity for change. Presiding Officer, I'd like to end on a comment made to me by Karen Harper. She said, whether this report will make any difference to such deep-rooted institutional problems remains to be seen. Cabinet Secretary, doing nothing is not an option. Shirking responsibility is not an option. Sticking Dame Eilish's report in a filing cabinet and forgetting about it is not an option. The public deserve better. Our police officers working under an SNP-created policing structure deserve better. The time for action is now.
I call on Hamza Yousaf to speak to and move the amendment 23450.2 for no more than 5 minutes, please, Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, well, with that, let me thank the Conservatives for bringing this motion to debate. Far from shirking from the report, I think it's an excellent opportunity to debate what is an excellent report. Let me thank Dame Eilish Angelini for that substantial report. There are a number of, as Liam Kerr rightly points out, a number of very substantial, very significant recommendations in that report, in that review, and I'm sure we'll give many of the key ones a good airing during this discussion. But nobody is hiding away from the recommendations. In fact, in that vein, I was very, very pleased to note this morning the Chief Constable spoke at the SPA board meeting about reviewing equality matters. He said, and I'll quote from him directly, racism and discrimination of any kind is deplorable and unacceptable. I utterly condemn it. It has no place in society and no place in the police service of Scotland. He then went on to accept and agree to Dame Eilish's recommendations for an independent review of equality matters. I absolutely am delighted to see that recommendation. I'm delighted that he has moved at pace. And in that vein, let me say that where the government can move at pace, we absolutely will. It has been 2 weeks of a 500-page or almost 500-page report with over 80 recommendations, a substantial amount, over 30 of them, for the Scottish Government. There will be no dither, there will be no delay. We are, of course, in the midst of a global pandemic, but I can absolutely assure Liam Kerr and the Conservative benches that I've spoken to the SPA, I've spoken to the Crown, I've spoken to Police Scotland, some of the key partners, and of course we'll take up conversation with the PARC as well, and we'll come to some of the recommendations for the PARC very, very carefully. But it was a substantial report, and I think what we have to do is make sure that we take our partners on board in the journey with us. I think all of us have a shared endeavour. Yes, and just 1 second, I will absolutely give way, but we have a shared endeavour, all of us across these benches, want to see a complaints process that is more fair, more transparent, and of course carries with it an even higher degree of public confidence. I give way to
Daniel Johnson.
I think the Cabinet Secretary could give way. Can I just ask him a simple question? Did he ask the Minister for Parliamentary Business whether or not a statement could be held on this report? Or is this the first time that he thought to speak on this matter?
Hamza Yousaf.
Well, Minister for Parliamentary Business and I have been having discussions about how difficult the timetable is in the run-up to the end of this year in terms of the hate crime bill, for example. So there is no time that the government has. The opposition have brought this forward. I'm more than happy to come back, as my motion has said, very clearly, very explicitly, that I hope will get Labour support, that I'm happy to come back early in the new year to give an update on where I think the government is on this. So there is no dither or delay. There is, of course, conversations that have to be had amongst partners. I think that is pretty understandable and a pretty sensible approach to take. What I would say about public confidence is really important we take the public with us. The SPA published a report yesterday, in fact, a finding of their latest independent survey, which showed that 61% of respondents rate local police as excellent or good. So there is a high degree of public confidence in policing. What I want to ensure through enacting Dame Eilish Angelini's recommendations in her report is that that percentage gets even higher. There's no complacency on my part, certainly, from the government. And that can be evidenced by the fact that we had an interim report in 2019 that had 30 recommendations approximately. 21 of those 30 recommendations have either partly or fully already been implemented. The ones that haven't been, I will give way in just a second, the ones that haven't been have been because they require legislative change. And I've always been very upfront and very clear that it would be sensible to wait for the final report so that we can take legislation not in a piecemeal fashion, but taken forward in a way that I think is more sensible than that. So, but I'm happy to
Liam Kerr.
I'm very grateful, and very briefly, notably on the ministerial, on the interim report, the Minister was straight into the chamber to give a ministerial report on it, and I think the difference is interesting. But will the Cabinet Secretary address my point about an action tracker? Is he going to address that in his speech, and will he implement it?
Hamza Yousaf.
I was the Minister that was in charge, of course, when the interim report was published in June 2019. The action tracker, I think, is no bad idea at all. I'm more than happy to look at that. I don't see an issue why we wouldn't do that. Of course, the report is public. The recommendations are public. People can view the recommendations, but if he thinks an action tracker will help to focus the minds, I'm more than happy to consider that for sure. I see no reasons why that should not be the case. In terms of the extent of many of Dame Eilish Angelini's recommendations, I think it is right that we do take time. They are significant. They will require legislative change. I have been having a discussion with the Justice Committee convener about how tight the timetable is for parliamentary business, and therefore getting legislation passed is going to be incredibly difficult, but it's important we don't rush it. I do accept that there is a need, a desire, a want for change in the complaints process. I associate myself with that desire. But what I would say is important that we get it right, not that we get it rushed. And let me just conclude by saying this, Presiding Officer. I recognise that every single one of us right across this chamber wants exactly the same thing. We want a complaints process that has the highest degree of public confidence, one that is seen to be absolutely independent, fair and transparent. My belief is we have a good complaints process in place, but I don't want just a good complaints process. I want the very best. I want the gold standard. And that is important for me as Justice Secretary, but more important, is vital for the public. And as the Chief Constable regularly states, policing in Scotland does not derive its consent from this Parliament, nor indeed from ministerial direction, but from the public. And therefore, I commit to work across parties and indeed with stakeholders to make sure that we consider Dame Eilish Angelini's report carefully, but also implement those recommendations as we go forward.
Could you
move the amendment in my name.
Thank you. We now go to Rhoda Grant, please. 4 minutes, please, Ms Grant.
Thank you, Presiding
Sorry,
Officer.
Ms Grant. I should also have said if you could also speak to and move your amendment number 23450.1. My apologies.
Happy to move our amendment, Presiding Officer. I welcome the publication of Eilish Angelini's report. 2 years ago, Scottish Labour's Daniel Johnston raised concerns about how police complaints were being handled. And as yet, other than this report, little appears to have happened to address this. We can't delay in implementing the report findings. When the Police Investigations and Review Commissioner, the then Police Investigation and Review Commissioner, Kate Frame, gave evidence to the Justice Committee back in November 2018, she said, in one example, a complaint involving someone who had been unlawfully detained was recorded by the police as a quality of service complaint. In another example, an allegation of rape was recorded by the police as incivility. And in a further example, in which someone was punched twice on the face, it was recorded by the police as excessive force rather than assault. And this is clearly unacceptable. It's important that the public have trust in the police service. If there are complaints about the service, either from within the force or from the general public, they need to be dealt with openly and transparently. In the short time available, Presiding Officer, I'll focus on our amendment, which highlights concerns about diversity. It's important that the makeup of the force is reflective of the community it serves, and there is some way to go to help Police Scotland achieve this. While we acknowledge targeted recruitment campaigns for underrepresented groups in the service, and we acknowledge that that is happening, but more needs to be done. Because the report made worrying observations about the treatment of officers from the minority group. It highlighted that Black, Asian and minority ethnic people who joined the force tended to leave within a short number of years rather than pursuing a career there. The report says the evidence suggests that some officers and staff experience discriminatory conduct, attitudes, behaviours, microaggressions, both internally and externally in the course of their duties. We heard that many of these incidents go unreported, even though some of these behaviours constitute misconduct. And there was a reluctance in those Black, Asian and minority ethnic officers to report for fear of being characterised as playing the race card. Again, clearly unacceptable. It's also clear that the drive to recruit more officers from diverse backgrounds is an aim to change the culture of the organisation. But sadly, the culture they were recruited to is driving them away because it's discriminatory. Similar attitudes have been raised by Rona Malone, attitudes of sexist and misogynist behaviour towards female officers. And she's not the first female officer to raise concerns. However, that appears to persist throughout the force. If these attitudes are held within the force, then it means that they're portrayed by officers and in their attitude to the public. And these attitudes need to be met by zero tolerance. And I believe that the recommendation that the force should be subject to a review by an independent organisation needs to be implemented urgently. And this would mean that the underlying institutional attitudes do not influence the outcome of such a review. The police must have confidence of the public, and our officers need to have confidence in the force, and therefore they are held to a high standard than the general public. A small minority can damage this reputation and make it difficult to work for ethical officers, even much more difficult. Where racism, misogyny and discrimination is allowed to go unchecked, it creates a workplace that breeds those attitudes, and it can't be put right by gestures. It requires a change in the institutional culture, and therefore we urge that the recommendations of the report are acted upon urgently.
Thank you. John Finney, please, for up to 4 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I can also thank Dame Ellis, her team, and indeed everyone who contributed to what's a significant piece of work, and it's rightly received a warm welcome, and it's warmly welcomed by the Scottish Green Party. Importantly, the report is properly actioned and examined, and the proposals that require consultation before any legislation is put in place are dealt with in an appropriate way. Now, I'm the convener of the Justice Subcommittee on Policing. I'm not speaking in that capacity, but I want the Chamber to know that the subcommittee is taking evidence from Dame Ellis on the 7th of December, and I look forward to that. I think the terms of reference that the committee that Dame Ellis worked to, fairness to all of those who make or are subject to a complaint, and issues around accountability, transparency, proportionality, effectiveness and efficiency, all referred to in the terms of reference, they have been delivered on. There's also mention of a learning culture and mention of relatively new systems. And of course, there have been relationships, tensions, and indeed tough wars, I think you could say. But I think we are getting there with that. There's been challenges around the procedures in relation to chief officers. Often, when that has been addressed, that's between the authority and PERC. And I think we need to draw a clear distinction between service complaints and complaints about individuals. So I look forward to that. The Code of Ethics is nothing new to be discussed in police circles. I think it's fair to say it means different things to different people, but I think it's a baseline which is important, and I look forward to discussion on that as well. Perhaps one of the amendments I'm most proud of securing in the Parliament was when the legislation for Police Scotland came in, and I had an amendment that officers joining Police Scotland swear an oath to undertake to uphold the human rights of citizens. So I think we know from recent events that Police Scotland have a very high regard to human rights. As we know, the COVID legislation has been overseen by an independent advisory group led by John Scott, QC. And it was Mr. Scott who read the inquiry into Stop and Search, which concluded, as I recall him saying, that the police should be the frontline defenders of citizens' human rights. So I'm very clear we must take a rights-based approach to this report, and I welcome the explicit use of that in the government's amendment. Of course, police officers have human rights too, and I think that there is much common ground across the parties. I hope everyone will support the Labour amendment as we do, and I welcome, as I think the Cabinet Secretary alluded to, the announcement by the Chief Constable today, responding specifically to that element covered by the Labour amendment. Victim involvement is something I thought was very interesting, and I know from a past career how people feel that their interests are not represented at a fatal accident inquiry, much like victims of sexual crime don't always feel that their interests are being represented in court of law. So there's an interesting discussion to have about how we address that in the terms that Dame Ellis uses. Meaningful involvement, constructive engagement. I also reflect on the term blameless error. There's a lot of things take place, a lot of interactions the police have, and I think we need, as Dame Ellis talks, a maturity and wisdom in how we respond. So some caution about changes to informal resolution. But however, in conclusion, Presiding Officer, however these deliberations take us, I hope we'll have regard to one phrase that could apply anywhere, and that is when Dame Ellis says the systems need to demonstrate a greater degree of humanity. If we get that approach right, everyone's interests will be met. Thank you very much.
I call Liam MacArthur for up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I too thank Liam Kerr for giving Parliament the chance to give this brief consideration of the report produced by Dame Ellis Angelini. As he observed, it's regrettable and perhaps slightly baffling that the Government has not seen fit to bring this forward in their own time, not least at a point where we're seeing a huge number of statements being shoehorned into the parliamentary timetable. But like others, can I also pay tribute to Dame Ellis for her work in producing this report, as well as her willingness to engage with the Justice Committee, including in relation to her interim findings. It's worth, though, I think, taking a moment to remind ourselves of the context in which this review was set up. Back in 2017, after the Government's rushed centralisation of Scottish policing, serious allegations were made against former Chief Constable Phil Gormley. Instead of being suspended pending investigation of those complaints, Mr Gormley was put on special leave. PERC, meanwhile, was left in the dark. Mr Gormley's return to work was later approved by the former SPA chair, Andrew Flanagan, who hastily backed down after an intervention by the then Justice Secretary, Michael Matheson. Shortly after, both Mr Gormley and Mr Flanagan left their posts. Little wonder that in her interim report, Dame Ellis referred to, quote, actual and perceived partiality due to relationships between senior police and SPA board members that were, in her words, too cosy. Susan Deakin alluded to something similar when she resigned as SPA chair at the end of 2019, citing governance and accountability arrangements for policing that are, quote, fundamentally flawed in structure, culture and practice. A year on, and Dame Ellis's final report paints a picture that is no less stark. Her recommendation to remove the option for police officers to avoid investigation by retiring reflects earlier calls by the Justice Committee. Giving PERC responsibility for key stages of proceedings involving senior officers makes sense. So too does the introduction of greater independence and transparency into all gross misconduct hearings. But it's the aspects of the report relating to inclusion and diversity, as well as mental health, that are most striking, and I particularly welcome, as John Finney did, the Labour Party's amendment. Discriminatory attitudes and behaviours more than 2 decades after the Macpherson report are wholly unacceptable. BAME officers leaving the service or unwilling to recommend it as a career choice for others should concern us all. An underlying sexism and machismo culture with a lack of willingness to accommodate requests for flexible working. All blunt messages requiring urgent and sustained action by Police Scotland, by the SPA and by the Scottish Government. And a blunt message too on the need for mental health to be given, quote, paramount importance for the police service. Over a year ago, my colleague Willie Rennie highlighted with the First Minister evidence of widespread issues of poor mental health affecting officers and staff. At the time, the Cabinet Secretary claimed he was very satisfied with police well-being. Since then, I've raised the issue with Mr Yousaf consistently, yet there is no sign yet of the Government getting to grips with the scale of the problem. That's not good enough, Deputy Presiding Officer. Our police deserve better, the public expects better, and this Parliament should demand better. Thank you.
Thank you for being so succinct. We now move to the open debate, and we are pushed for time, so speeches of no more than 4 minutes. Gordon Lyndhurst, followed by Rona Mackay.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. May I start at what I consider to be the beginning and should be emphasised. Our police officers do an often difficult job very well indeed, and we should always remember that and that we are fortunate in Scotland to have them. We should be thankful to them for the work that they do. Individual police officers, far less the whole of Police Scotland, however, do not always get things right, of course not. But since becoming an MSP in 2016, I can say that local police commanders have always been ready and willing to look at specific constituent cases that I raised with them and considered them and acted if something had not been dealt with as it ought to have been. Those issues varied considerably, from rural constituents concerned that the police were not there for them, to disagreements between cyclists and others that maybe went too far on one side or the other. And I say that as both a pedestrian and cyclist myself. Policing is about duty and responsibility to the people of Scotland, about treating whoever comes into contact with the police, for whatever reason, with fairness and respect. And the word whoever does not need qualification or definition, because it includes everyone in Scotland. Of course, it is not the job of the police to take sides with individuals against others, quite the opposite. The police must be confirmed and protected in their neutrality from any attempts by individuals or organisations to become involved in what are essentially political disputes. The place to resolve political disputes in a democracy is here in Parliament. The duty and responsibility of the police is to apply the law without fear, favour or affection towards anyone or any cause. Now, of course, this does not mean the police have no discretion about how, when, where and why they approach the application of the law. That can be the difficult part of any job, and maybe where Police Scotland has sometimes fallen down, including internally. So there's not only room, but need for improvement, as Dame Eilish Angiolini has found. All of the recommendations made in her report should be considered carefully. Understanding, for example, how an increase in powers for the Police Investigations and Review Commissioner could work. Greater independence within a complaints and investigations process should be a good thing. Provided, of course, that an intelligent and informed understanding of policing is applied in that context, especially where we have seen attempted interference in such processes in the past by government. And it would also be welcome if the Scottish Government collaborates with the UK Government in understanding and seeking to apply, in our Scottish context, some of the useful lessons learnt from the English experience, but at the same time avoiding any repetition of mistakes that may have unintentionally happened there. At the end of the day, however, considered reforms encouraged by the recommendations will be futile unless wider structural issues and funding deficits for Police Scotland are resolved. Centralisation of administration and cuts in funding under this SNP government have had a huge number of negative knock-on effects. So I hope for and look forward to real action for real people in respect of this report and its consideration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Lyndhurst. I call Rona Mackay to be followed by Liz Smith. Ms Mackay, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This is a very important debate and I thank the Conservatives for bringing it to the Chamber. It's very important for a number of reasons, but primarily because the public must have access to a comprehensive and fair system of complaints, investigations and misconduct issues in relation to police. This report from Dame Eilish Angelini is extremely detailed and runs to 489 pages and 81 recommendations. That in itself speaks volumes about the complexity of the issue. Clearly, there's a lot for Police Scotland, the Scottish Police Authority, the PIRC and the Scottish Government to consider. Presiding Officer, I have to say that as a member of the Justice Committee and the Police Subcommittee since 2016, I've been extremely impressed with the professionalism and ethics of Police Scotland, who consistently cooperate with both committees fully and transparently. The COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated that even under extreme pressure, Police Scotland can operate in a proportionate and efficient manner to maintain public confidence. That said, of course, there are issues relating to individual cases. Liam Kerr and Liam MacArthur have highlighted some, and they do throw up questions, and there must be an effective process for dealing with them. Some high-profile historical cases have demonstrated the urgent need for reform of the complaint system. In any democracy, the police service must be held to account for its actions if a complaint is raised, because police officers are, like everyone, human and fallible, and things go wrong. The report lays out starkly the challenges that exist in the complaint procedure and at times deficiencies in the historic culture of Police Scotland. As the Cabinet Secretary said, many of the recommendations in the report require legislation which will be considered by the Government, informed by stakeholder views. Many have already been progressed following Dame Eilish's interim report published in June 2019. For example, Police Scotland have worked to make their complaint system clearer and more accessible on their website, and have resolved to many of the complaints simply by direct conversation with the complainant rather than instigating a lengthy multi-stage process. Presiding Officer, Chief Constable Ian Livingston has been extremely clear that discriminatory attitudes have no place in a modern police service, and in that regard, Police Scotland are working hard to address this by developing diversity and equality within the force. However, the report does highlight that there has been discriminatory treatment towards minority groups, and highlighted by Rhoda Grant. I find that deeply troubling and agree with Dame Eilish's recommendations in that respect, and hope that measures are to address this have progressed urgently. The Cabinet Secretary confirmed today that the Chief Inspector has already Chief Constable has already agreed to a fundamental review of this, and I welcome that. There are also recommendations in relation to deaths and custody investigations, structural changes and additional powers recommended for the PIRC, gross misconduct hearings, and that a code of ethics be given a basis in statute. Presiding Officer, there's so much in this report, it's only possible to scratch the surface of the detail in a short speech. Dame Eilish Angelini is giving evidence to the Subcommittee on Policing on December the 7th, and I look forward to hearing more of the detail of the report. So in conclusion, Presiding Officer, this report is very welcome, and a review of the complaint system was very much needed. I congratulate Dame Eilish Angelini for this enormous body of work, acknowledge the steps already taken by Police Scotland to address some fundamental issues that are vital to ensuring the public can have full confidence and pride in our national police force. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I call Liz Smith, followed by Fulton McGregor. Ms Smith, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. In the 2013 parliamentary debate about the merger of Scotland's 8 police forces, I recall my colleague John Lamont at the time expressing his concerns about how the SNP intended to implement the reforms. Not the reforms themselves, but specifically about how local accountability could be protected, how financial savings could be delivered, and how there could be much greater transparency within the system, especially if there were serious complaints or disciplinary issues exposed. And that's why, at the time, the Scottish Conservatives were keen to see directly elected police commissioners, and why we also wanted to see a commitment to 1,000 extra police officers on the beat. We believed then, and we believe now, that policing works best when there is local accountability and when there is full transparency over how the police force operates, including within the complaint system. As Liam Kerr pointed out, however, Dame Eilish Angelini's report fully exposes some fundamental flaws within the system. Flaws which I believe, unless they are quickly and properly addressed, will undermine public trust in the system. Because even if there have been some operational improvements, the report makes it abundantly clear that not nearly enough is being done to ensure that police officers will be treated fairly and given the necessary support. The report is extremely clear. Overall, there is a poor complaint system, and that is simply not acceptable. And whilst I think the Cabinet Secretary appears to recognise that some things have gone wrong, specifically that there has not been a sufficiently robust or transparent system in place, he needs to address why this is the case. Undoubtedly, he should be most concerned about the stubborn problem of racism, sexism, homophobia and other discriminatory behaviour within the force, in what Dame Eilish referred to as the canteen culture. So too should he be concerned about the knock-on effect that this has had on recruitment and retention, in particular of women officers and those from ethnic minorities. And on this theme, Dame Eilish is singling out the Scottish Police Federation for not being as approachable as officers have a right to expect, and that's something that should surely worry the Cabinet Secretary too, because we must realise that it's hard enough for police officers as it is without feeling that their professional standards are being undermined by bigotry or discrimination. And I know from his previous statements in the Chamber, the Cabinet Secretary genuinely believes that that is unacceptable. But we are 20 years on from the Macpherson report, and it is very apparent that lessons still need to be learned. So the Cabinet Secretary needs to make a strong commitment that he will do all in his power to stop this ugly culture and to ensure that we make some progress. And I think he should also think about why there has not been sufficient transparency in the system. Specifically tell us that if he will adopt Dame Eilish Angelini's recommendation that the Police Investigations Review Commissioner should have more powers, become more accountable to the Scottish Parliament so that there can be greater scrutiny of decision-making, and that any hearings of gross misconduct should be held in public. This, of course, follows the very unsatisfactory situations which have surrounded the departure of some senior officers that Liam MacArthur talked about, when the full facts have not been made clear. Dame Eilish has obviously identified why there needs to be legislative changes in order to address the concerns that her report identifies, and she also recommends that there should be much stronger relationships between the Scottish and UK governments to share best practice and to learn from each other's failings. And can I close with a comment from the current Chief Constable, Ian Livingston, who said that the core values of the police should be integrity, fairness, respect, and a commitment to upholding human rights. He is absolutely correct, but it is very clear that at present we have a long way to go until these values can be fully delivered.
Thank you very much, Ms Smith. I call Fulton McGregor to be followed by Claire Baker. Mr McGregor, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It is a fundamental in any democracy that the police service is held to account for its actions, and I'm sure that Parliament will agree that the report of the Independent Review of Complaints Handling, Investigations and Misconduct Issues in relation to policing is a comprehensive and robust report. As others have been mentioned, the report sits at nearly 500 pages and overall makes 81 recommendations, which in itself reassures me that this review, the first of its kind, has done its job of investigating our complaints procedures in regards to policing. Dame Eilish Angelini will give evidence to the subcommittee on policing on the 7th of December, as others have said, and as a member of this committee, I welcome this as an appropriate place to ask questions and begin to make progress on the recommendations. It certainly does not feel like, to me, that it's been put in a filing cabinet, as per an earlier remark in this debate. Presiding Officer, it's vital that anyone can make a complaint that is responded to fairly. There have been challenges in the complaints process, and while we're all very well served by our police service, who we are indebted to, we need to be able to recognise when things are not quite as they should be. It's in everybody's interest, including the police, that the complaints procedure is carried out in a fair manner that is transparent. Overall, this will strengthen the public's confidence in policing, which benefits both society and the police force themselves. And as local MSPs, and as we've heard from others, we all know of situations from constituents on this issue, and it's really important, I'll say again, that the public have trust in this process. But with the presentation of such a robust and detailed report, it's my hope that the time will be taken for the Scottish Government to fully understand the difficulties and concerns that have been set out, consider the recommendations and how to appropriately implement them, and overall engage with those who have been affected, and also, of course, link in with the Justice and Justice subcommittees as appropriate. Legislative changes are likely needed, which will require meticulous planning and consideration, but we aren't starting from scratch. The interim report published in June 2019 has already seen many changes take place in Police Scotland. There are now audits of complaint processes, improved training, and an improvement in the relationship between key bodies. The complaints procedure is also now clearer, and it is evident that Police Scotland are making efforts to rectify the issues that are seen in their procedures. Police Scotland acknowledge the presence of discrimination and have stated they are committed to addressing discriminatory attitudes and behaviours, and I think this is very important in picking up on Liz Smith's points in the previous remarks. But, Presiding Officer, like all our public services, Police Scotland have played a pivotal role in responding to this pandemic, and this debate is very, very important, and it will continue long after today's chamber business. But in the midst of a pandemic, it's only right that elected representatives like yourself come to the chamber, or in the case of myself, here at home, and stand up for our officers on the street, facing higher risks than usual, having been on the front line while the pandemic has hit our nation, ensuring compliance with difficult and ever-changing restrictions with empathy and in a supportive manner, and yes, with enforcement as a last resort when required. So I want to put on record my heartfelt thanks to all officers, and of course a special thanks to those working in Coatbridge and Chryson. Presiding Officer, to conclude, public confidence in Police Scotland, especially during this tough period of the pandemic, remains high. Each person who interacts with the police brings with them their own experience, both positive and negative, and each police officer also brings their experience. It's my hope that with these changes, I welcome the report, and it's my hope that with these changes implemented over time, we will see this rating with the public grow even higher. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, and I call Claire Baker to be followed by Shona Robinson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to speak in this afternoon's debate. Dame Angelini has produced a significant report which is wide-ranging and has many important recommendations where we need to see prompt action. Dame Angelini was commissioned by the Home Office to produce a report into deaths in custody in the UK published in October 2017. As the Cabinet Secretary knows, this is an area where I have been raising concerns and calling for reform, following my engagement with the family of Sheku Bayo, who died in police custody in May 2015 on the streets in Kirkcaldy. Mr Bayo's family and friends have suffered, and it's been a long journey for them to the public inquiry, which needs to provide them with answers and bring forward recommendations to prevent similar deaths in the future. Following the 2017 report, I called for comparable work to be undertaken in Scotland, and I very much welcome the broad manner in which the independent review into complaints handling, investigations and misconduct issues in relation to policing has been approached. Labour's amendment highlights the very worrying evidence presented by the report of racism, homophobia and misogyny experienced by police officers within the force. I have to say that I was disappointed by part of the response of the Scottish Police Federation. It is regrettable that the SPF gave the impression that they were downplaying the criticism, describing it as a police service they didn't recognise, when it is clear that the report reflects the lived experience of police officers affected by an unacceptable culture. I support the need for a fundamental review of equality matters, and I welcome the Chief Constable's commitment to an independent review. I very much welcome the recommendation for deaths in custody to be treated with the same urgency as homicide investigations, and for the family of the deceased to have access to free legal advice and representation from the earliest point and throughout any subsequent inquiry. I have seen how overwhelming it is to be dealing with the immediate investigation, then the police complaint system, and attempting to find answers, while all the time you are dealing with the grief and loss of a loved one. Access to free legal advice would go some way toward addressing the imbalance felt by a family experiencing a death in custody and providing support at a traumatic time. It took 30 days until the police officers who attended the arrest of Sheku Bayu gave evidence to PARC. On the day of Mr Bayu's death, the officers all returned to the same station and spent 8 hours together. I do understand that police officers are entitled to the same protection as all citizens. However, the current legislation, the regulations and at the time of the case, the guidance creates an environment which makes it impossible for information not to be shared at key moments in an investigation. That is not acceptable, and the recommendation that all police officers should be interviewed swiftly and without contact with other officers in death in custody cases is obvious reform that needs to happen. Also, the recommendation that early retirement would not exclude police officers from gross misconduct cases is important and retains and strengthens accountability. The recommendations regarding PARC identify some of the key issues that have risked undermining the reputation of PARC. There is a need to balance the number of former police officers in PARC with expertise from outside the force, increase transparency and accountability as well as democratic oversight. While there will be those who may want to defend the current system of police complaints and the role of PARC, the report does address significant issues on which we need to see demonstrable progress. This is an extensive report and I've only focused on a few issues that have been central to my work as an MSP. Presiding Officer, it is only a few weeks since the report into policing during the miners' strike was published, and it made clear that when the police become isolated from the community, when they lack transparency and accountability, the souring of that relationship can last for years within communities and it can be difficult to rebuild trust. Our police force must be welcoming and inclusive to all, which can only strengthen its position in our communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms Speaker. And I call Shona Robertson, the last speaker in the open debate. Ms Robertson, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I also begin by thanking Dame Eilish Angelini for her hard work in compiling this very comprehensive report with its 81 recommendations, which of course builds on the many recommendations in the interim report. And I also, like others have done, want to put on record my thanks to the police service, who of course continue to enjoy robust levels of public confidence in policing across the country. And of course they've been doing a very challenging job during the pandemic. But I think we can all agree that it is fundamental that the police service is held to account for its actions, and that anyone can make a complaint and in doing so can be confident that it is responded to fairly and robustly. The report is clear about the challenges in the complaints process and, importantly, about the culture that needs to change. Key recommendations include expanding the role of the PARC, and of course that will be crucial. The final report, which of course was received by the Scottish Government just over 2 weeks ago, will need to be properly considered by Police Scotland, by the SPA, by the PARC itself, and of course by the Scottish Government. And that will take some time to properly consider all the recommendations. I think it's also important. Yes, of course.
Liam Kerr.
I'm very grateful. Given in the amendment, the Cabinet Secretary says he will respond to the report in the new year, does the member think it's good enough to wait at least 2 months to hear what the Scottish Government's response is to this major report?
Shona Robertson.
Well, you've heard some of the response here today. I think what is important is, as this is taken forward in detail, that all stakeholders are involved and that this Parliament indeed is involved. And of course, as a fellow member of the Justice Committee, I would have thought Liam Kerr would want the Justice Committee to be very involved in discussing the recommendations. And on that note, of course, Dame Eilish Angelini will be giving evidence soon to the Justice Subcommittee on the 7th of December, an important part of the parliamentary process going forward. It's important to recognise also that many operational improvements have already been implemented by Police Scotland and others. In fact, of the 30 recommendations in the interim report, I understand that around 21 have already been partly or fully implemented, and that's important to recognise. Others, though, as has been said already, require legislative change, which will need to be fully informed by stakeholder views and, of course, prioritised within the legislative programme. Clearly, one of the issues that has been raised and has received quite rightly major attention has been the need to tackle the equality matters raised. And I think it is right that an independent review is taken forward and that the Chief Constable has moved swiftly to act on this. It is crucial that our police service reflects our society more generally. And I did agree with the comments made by Liam MacArthur that we're so long after the Macpherson report that we still see some of these issues remain, and we must make progress on those. It's important all parties have the opportunity to consider these recommendations in detail. Parliament has a really important role in doing so. The Cabinet Secretary today has confirmed that he will take forward the consultation involving police staff associations and trade unions, and of course that he will update Parliament on the discussions with key stakeholders early in the new year. I'm happy to support the amendment in the name of Hamza Youssef.
Thank you very much. Closing speeches. I call on Daniel Johnson for Labour. Mr Johnson.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. I too would like to echo the thanks across the Chamber to Dame Eilish Angelini for her very wide-ranging and thorough report. I'd also like to thank the Conservatives for bringing forward this motion so that Parliament has the opportunity to consider this important report. But I'd most importantly like to thank the police, like others have. In my time on the Justice Committee and as Justice Spokesperson for Labour, I was struck by the dedication and integrity of the many officers that I spoke to, both on the front line, but also at the most very senior levels. And I have no doubt about their dedication and commitment to policing by consent. But what is clear from this report is there are serious deficiencies in the organisation and systems, and the outcomes that result from these run contrary to those individuals' efforts. And I think given the very recent creation of Police Scotland, and indeed the concerns that were set out at its inception, I think this does lead one to the conclusion there are some fundamental flaws in terms of the creation of Police Scotland and the Police and Fire Reform Act of 2013 that need to be addressed. Because let's be clear, this report, and as people have pointed out, are almost 500 pages long, 80 recommendations. Indeed, the executive summary alone is almost 30 pages. Makes for very uncomfortable reading indeed. I think that the points that we have highlighted in our amendment regarding equalities and the treatment of minorities in the police are perhaps the most stark. They were unexpected in the report, but I have to say, for me, not entirely surprising. Indeed, I would remark that it's almost a quarter of a century since the publication of the Macpherson report, and the fact that that report needs to be quoted in this one, I find very serious. Indeed, I spoke to many of the same people that Liam Kerr spoke to, including Rona Malone and other female police officers who pursued complaints. And the stories they told me, frankly, were shocking. They experienced, first of all, systemic opposition to their complaints. Equipment not suited or suitable for females or people of smaller statures in policing roles. Vital safety equipment. When they did raise complaints, they faced the system being used against them, the recategorisation of complaints, frustration of them pursuing them. They saw the system being used against them in terms of their fitness for frontline service, and ultimately found themselves in positions where they had no option but to resign from the police service. That is unacceptable. It is a situation that has to be confronted by the police, and I would urge officers, senior officers, to take these issues seriously and to tackle them head on. It is not enough to say that that is not their intent or their objective in terms of the way they manage their service. They need to accept that casual and inaction is just as much at fault in these situations. But I think we must also take very seriously the points that have been highlighted regarding the structures and governance and oversight. As many people have been pointed out, at the heart of our policing is the principle of policing by consent. And as Gordon Lyndhurst pointed out, we need real action for real people. But we cannot have confidence that we have policing by consent if the fundamental structures there to oversee our police are not working properly. And that is what this report tells us. It tells us that the PERC, the body which we charge with investigating serious issues within our police, does not have the powers or the standing that it needs in order to do its job properly. We see here that the SPA does not have the capacity or capability to undertake its job properly. Indeed, the former chair of the SPA says exactly that. In short, the adequacy of the legislation that was brought forward in 2013 was simply not there. We need to invest in the systems. We need to ensure that the police can invest in its organisation, that we have adequate oversight, because otherwise, quite simply, we are undermining the very principle of policing by consent. And the government should reflect on this. The fact that it has already conceded it will need to bring forward legislation to correct that act so soon after the creation of Police Scotland is a very serious situation to find itself in indeed. Thank you.
Thank you. Just before I said you must conclude. And I'll call Hamza Youssef to close for the government. Please, Cabinet Secretary, up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This has been a very helpful debate. Let me try to address some of the key points that members have raised. I think the point that's made by Daniel Johnson in his remarks around officers from a minority ethnic persuasion, but also the complaints and the concerns raised by female officers, I think is a good place to begin. It's a point that's been made by many members across the Chamber and been made very well by members such as Liam MacArthur, Liz Smith, Jonah Robinson, and then, as I said, Rhoda Grant, and as I just said, Daniel Johnson a moment ago, being no doubt that the government does view that situation with concern. I am equally, on the other hand, very pleased that very swift action and decisive action has been taken by the Chief Constable to accept that recommendation in Dame Eilish Angelini's report. I noticed too that the various staff associations that represent either minority groups or indeed female officers have been very positive about that swift action by the Chief Constable. I noticed the comment straight away from the LGBTI Staff Association, the Scottish Women's Development Forum, Semper Scotland, who represent ethnic minority officers, all welcoming very swift and very decisive action. Can I say from a personal perspective, I speak to the Chief Constable very frequently, and during the pandemic speak to him on a weekly basis, if not even more than that, and I can tell the Chamber very clearly that I believe he has an absolute commitment to issues of equality and diversity that has come up in conversation far well in advance of the Dame Eilish Angelini report review, and I've got every confidence in him as well as in the SPA in taking forward that work. But I agree with members right across the Chamber that what Dame Eilish Angelini highlights in her report is of grave concern indeed. From a number of members too has been the suggestion that the current system is not fit for purpose, and I think that's doing a slight disservice to those who work, for example, at the PERC. We know that in the 1920 annual report from the PERC that 240 complaint handling reviews were conducted, 30 investigations resulting from police referrals, 46 investigations referring from the Crown. So there is a great deal of work to be done. There are many recommendations, and Liz Smith asked the question quite directly. She said, does the government believe that the PERC should have more powers? Yes, that's a very clear thread from Dame Eilish Angelini's review. It comes across in many of her recommendations. It is right, though, that the government takes time to speak to the PERC, to the Crown, to Police Scotland, to the SPA, to exactly navigate how and when we do that. Of course, I give way to Liam Kerr.
Liam Kerr.
Yeah, I'm very grateful. Does the Cabinet accept, though, just on that point, that the SNP have undermined the independence of the PERC in the past, which has led to some of the problems identified in the Angelini report?
Cabinet Secretary. No, I don't accept that at all. In terms of Liam Kerr's point, and I think it was raised by one or two other members about the government needing to come forward and bring a statement on this report. It does say in our amendment, of course, that will come back early in the new year. I think Liam Kerr suggested incorrectly that when the interim report was produced that I came and gave a statement to this chamber. I think he'll want to just check the record on that and perhaps clarify. I came in front of the Justice Committee and gave evidence to the interim report. I haven't been invited yet by the Justice Committee or the Subcommittee on Policing. I understand that the Subcommittee on Policing may want me to come back in the new year. I'd be happy to do that. If the subcommittee wants me back earlier than that, then of course that is for them to issue the invitation to me, and of course I'll do what I can to come forward. So I'm more than happy to come forward. I think it does make sense, though, for there to be a little bit of time, and it doesn't have to be an extensive amount of time, but a bit of time for the partners and the key stakeholders to understand how we're going to take forward the recommendations and implement them. We also have to think about the legislative timetable as well, particularly when we are in an election year and a new parliament forthcoming. Gordon Lyndhurst was right to point out the resource implications. I think that's another reason why we have to work through the recommendations. There will undoubtedly be resource implications if we are to accept these recommendations. Just as a reminder to him, of course, he was wrong in saying that there's been cuts recently to policing in Scotland. That's not the case. We, of course, increased Police Scotland's budget last year by 60 million. That was 10 million more than the Conservatives asked for. What I would say is that we, as our amendment says, take the recommendations of Dame Eilish Angelini extraordinarily seriously, but also the concerns that were raised in Rhoda Grant's amendment we take also equally seriously as well. So we will be supporting Labour's amendment in that regard. And let me just end where I did in my opening remarks, Presiding Officer, that policing, as the Chief Constable regularly states, is not derived, policing by consent is not derived by consent of ministers or consent of this Parliament, but consent of the public. It is imperative that we do everything we can in our power to increase that confidence in policing that already exists. I certainly commit myself to come in front of this Parliament, in front of its committees, as often as they would like me to do, to give continued updates on this report, but give an absolute commitment that we will take this report not just seriously, but implement the recommendations to ensure that we continue to give that confidence and increase that confidence in policing that we all want to see right across the board.
Thank you. And I call on Margaret Mitchell, close with Conservatives. Up to 6 minutes, please, Ms Mitchell.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. In 2017, the Justice Committee decided to carry out post-legislative scrutiny of the Police and Fire Reform Scotland Act 2012, which established a single police force in Scotland. It became evident thereafter that police handling of complaints was a major issue. In 2018, ministers asked Dame Eilish Angelini to conduct an independent review into the effectiveness of the new system dealing with complaints against police in Scotland and how well such complaints were investigated and the processes reviewed. The final report includes a number of welcome recommendations to strengthen the Office of the Police Investigations and Review Commissioner. These include, but not limited to, reforming PERC to include 1 Commissioner and 2 Deputy Commissioners. The Commissioner being appointed by nomination of the Scottish Parliament, not ministers, and made accountable to the Parliament, giving PERC the statutory power to call in an investigation of a complaint and the ability to investigate a current practice or policy of Police Scotland, the power to recommend suspension of a senior officer if PERC considers that not suspending the officer may prejudice an effective misconduct investigation, and transferring the statutory preliminary assessment function from the Scottish Police Authority to PERC. Crucially, many of these new powers for PERC will require legislative change. The Justice Committee took evidence on Dame Eilish's interim report recommendations in June 2019, and a third of the 30 recommendations require legislative change and include important and necessary changes to, for example, deal with vexatious complaints, give PERC the power when investigating a serious incident to compel police officers to attend an interview within a reasonable timescale, establish a new statutory board of members appointed through the Scottish Public Appointments process to scrutinise the work and performance of PERC, to vest in the Commissioner or potentially a Deputy Commissioner the power to make recommendations to direct reconsideration of complaints and to place a statutory duty on the Chief Constable to comply with recommendations unless there are sound, overriding, operational or practical reasons for not doing so. In June 2019, during the interim report recommendation evidence session with the Justice Secretary, I asked if the necessary legislation would be prioritised, and he assured me that it would be discussed with partners that summer. Despite this, Almost 18 months later, not one of these recommendations has been implemented. Whilst I understand the coronavirus has disrupted the Scottish Government's legislative programme, the fact remains that this required legislation has not featured anywhere in its legislative agenda. And in terms of the Government's amendment and the Justice Secretary's remarks today, Cabinet Secretary, the key stakeholders have already met and discussed these interim recommendations. What is urgently required now is legislative action from the Scottish Government. Have I got time? Yeah, okay.
Cabinet Secretary.
Would the member at least acknowledge that 21 of the 30 recommendations have either been partly or fully implemented, but it wouldn't make sense to do legislation in a piecemeal fashion? Did you not think it was sensible to wait for the final report and then, of course, bring forward full legislative plans to take forward those recommendations in full?
Ms Mitchell.
Cabinet Secretary, if you look at the ones that I have just gone out, there are definitely measures there and recommendations which should have featured in a legislative process. So a talking shop is not what we required. As Liam Kerr pointed out, there has been no ministerial statement on the final report published over 2 weeks ago, which hardly inspires confidence, particularly given the substantial number of recommendations in the final report that also require changes to legislation. More generally, it is important to put the complaints review recommendation in context. The police have the power to deprive a fellow citizen of their liberty, and as such, their interaction with the public must be beyond reproach. Equally, however, it is also the case, even when acting with absolute propriety, police actions can make them the subject of unfair, adverse comment and reactions and vexatious complaints. The necessary checks and balances must therefore be in place to ensure that police have confidence in the complaint system when carrying out their essential role, and that the public is reassured that police engagement is fair, proportionate and does not infringe human rights. Culture is therefore essential, and that categories of complaints, and especially those which allege criminality, are dealt with fairly, timeously, and are subject to independent investigation. That's why an accessible complaints procedure is so important, and the report confirms that here more needs to be done to improve that process. Crucially, as the Labour amendment highlights, the process must reach out to communities to tackle the culture of fear, mistrust, and more widely provide options for different ways for the public to complain. In conclusion, Deputy Presiding Officer, the independent report recommendations need to be implemented. This means that the structures, powers and accountability of those agencies involved in the complaint process also require some fundamental changes to strengthen the system further and enhance public confidence. Currently, the necessary legislation to set in place the checks and balances to make this happen are not in place, and that is the situation which cannot and must not be allowed to continue.
Thank you very much, Ms Mitchell. That concludes the debate on the independent review of complaints, handling, investigations and misconduct issues in relation to policing. There will be a short pause before we move on to the next item of business.